Greetings, comrades! When you hear about ghost towns, what do you usually picture? A small early 20th century American settlement somewhere in the Great Plains? Medieval villages in Tuscany? Former mining camps in South America? Gold rush remnants in Western Australia, or maybe huge Chinese ghost neighborhoods? Of course, there are such towns in Russia, and today I will present you 10 most interesting Russia's ghost towns. And yes, most of them were built during the Soviet Union, so they will look exactly as you would expect. The town of Neftegorsk, Sakhalin Oblast, probably the youngest of the ghost towns of Russia, for it was built in 1964. At the same time, it was once one of the most comfortable settlements on the island, because it was built specifically for the oil workers who lived here with their families and developed the local oil field discount in 1962. By 1995, it was home to about 3,200 people. It would seem obvious why it went into decline, because the oil had run out, right? Unfortunately, no. In May 1995, there was a strong earthquake near the town, and in just a few seconds, the town was wiped off the face of the earth. Neftegorsk had 17 large block 5-story buildings, all of which collapsed. About 2,000 people died. The town was not rebuilt, and those who were lucky enough to survive were relocated to other settlements on Sakhalin, after which many decided to leave the island for good. Instead of residential houses in Neftegorsk, there are now tombstones with the number of the house, as well as mainly nameless graves with the inscription "Unidentified man" or "Unidentified woman." Other settlements in the north of Sakhalin were also affected, such as the work settlement of Kalenda, which now looks like this and can also qualify as a ghost town. By the way, the earthquake almost caused a real diplomatic scandal. The fact is that the Japanese authorities offered assistance in rescue work to help the wounded and people left under the rubble, but Russian President Boris Yeltsin rejected this proposal, saying, "We are still able to cope on our own." And then they may say to us, "Give us the Kuril Islands for our help." At the same time, many experts today know that if the Japan's help had been accepted, the number of those found alive might have been higher. You'll likely find some kind of correlation here without me, but mostly my list will include towns that were built not in the most obvious places to live. Here's Kadykchan in Kolyma. The town was located near the large Arkagalinskaya power station, which needed coal to operate. This is why Kadykchan was founded specifically for local coal production workers in 1943. It was built, of course, by Gulag prisoners, and by the end of the Soviet Union about 6,000 people lived there. Also until the very moment of the catastrophe, not natural this time, but man-made. In 1996 there was an explosion at the local mine. 6 people died. After that, the authorities decided to mothball the mine and freeze the enterprise. And since it was actually the only place of work for the local population, the town gradually began to empty. In 2001, 4 streets were still inhabited, despite the fact that the houses had already lost heat and electricity. Can you imagine what it is to live without electricity and heat in Kolyma? By 2010, the settlement was deserted, even though according to the data of 2022, there are still 3 people living in it. By the way, it is said that the name of the abandoned town was prophetic for it. In Ivan language, it supposedly means Valley of Death. Let's go back to the European part of the country briefly to show what typical abandoned settlements look like here. Charanda is not a ghost town after all, but rather a ghost village. It is located in the Vologda region and was once one of the largest settlements on the White Sea-Onega waterway. Charanda was first mentioned in historical chronicles in the 13th century, and in the 17th century it received the status of a town. Under Ivan the Terrible, Charanda was a major trade center, and according to the data of the 1646, about 14,000 people lived in the area. For the 17th century it was really a large settlement, but gradually it began to fall into disrepair. The local trade route began to lose its importance, houses collapsed, the wharf on Lake Vozha fell into decay, the church collapsed, and the inhabitants slowly began to leave the settled places. In 1775-1776, Charanda lost the status of a town. 1921, 70 dwelling houses and 450 people. 2002, 5 people. 2015, the last resident died. Today, Charandas sometimes comes alive when relatives of former residents come here for the summer to enjoy the nature. Now there are rumors that the historical place is going to be restored to attract tourists, but so far all this remains a hearsay. Bichevinka, aka Finval, aka Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky 54. These names do not exist on the map of Russia and never have. The whole point is that the city was founded in the 1960s as a base for military submariners and their families. The only way to get to the capital of the region was by ship, which sailed once a week. Naturally, both the city and the base itself were strictly classified, and up to 2,000 people lived here. It can be said that Bichevinka became famous only at the end of the 20th century, after it was hastily resettled. At the same time, many personal belongings of the residents can still be found in the town. It is extremely difficult for marauders to get here, and when the town was resettled, the residents were allowed to take on board the ships only the most necessary things. Many possessions had to be abandoned. The settlement became a ghost in 1996, when the authorities relocated the submarine workers to neighboring settlements closer to Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. The small population of Finval was also moved there, when the authorities realized that it was unprofitable and pointless to maintain the settlement. On the other shore of the Bichevinskaya Bay, there was a similar settlement called Shipunsky, built for the local rocketman. It was disbanded almost at the same time as Finval. Both towns are quite popular with tourists who want to see huge rusty ships left here and the abandoned 3- and 5-story buildings that stand in the bay near the mountains and hills. The most abandoned town in Russia is probably Maloga. This ghost town in the Yaroslav region is often compared to the mythical Atlantis, all because it was flooded by a reservoir. And Maloga is also very old. The first mention of it dates back to the 12th century. For many years the town was buzzing with life. In the 1930s, for example, there were more than 900 houses and a lot of stores and trading stands on its territory. The population was around 7,000 people. The history of the town was cut short in 1935, when the USSR authorities decided to build the Rybinsk Reservoir and hydroelectric power plant, and Maloga, according to the plans, was to be flooded. The relocation of local residents to Rybinsk, which lasted almost 4 years, began in the spring of 1937. In addition to this town, during the construction of the Rybinsk HPP, 700 settlements in the area of the Volga tributaries were flooded, completely submerged and destroyed. Since 1946, Maloga has been completely underwater. The remains of the town can only be seen when the water level drops. For example, in the 1990s it dropped by 1.5 meters, and the cobbled streets, remains of buildings, wrought iron gates and slabs in the cemetery were visible. On the shore of the Rybinsk Reservoir nowadays, a chapel was built in memory of the lost city. There is also a homemade monument in the form of an arrow with the inscription "Sorry Maloga", especially since there is a lot to be sorry for. Can you imagine how this very resettlement of local residents was organized in the USSR in the 1930s? Churches were simply blown up. The owners of wooden houses were ordered to dismantle them on their own and transport them or float them by water to a new place of residence. The archives of the Rybinsk Historical and Architectural Museum contain a lot of letters of forced migrants in which they asked the authorities not to evict them before winter, to wait until spring, so that they would not have to assemble huts from logs that had not dried out after rafting. But the authorities were inexorable in 1937, in 1938 and 1939, although there was still plenty of time before the flooding. If it was ordered to dismantle and raft a particular house in October, it must be October. In the same archives there is another, even more chilling record. I report, there are 294 citizens who wished to live their lives along with their possessions when filling the reservoir. However, as it turned out later, the Maloga tragedy may well have saved the country from a much bigger tragedy. During the war years, including the most difficult period of confrontation with the Nazis near Moscow, it was the Rybinsk and Uglich hydroelectric power plants, still unfinished, that uninterruptedly supplied the capital with electricity. The settlement of Kolovanstroy in the Kuryinsky district of Altai Krai was founded in the 1930s and had a population of about 5,000 people. The local adult population was mostly miners, working at the nearby tungsten mine. The workers who mined tungsten in Dynamitne Mountain received good wages and could afford to buy such delicacies as caviar, balik, and even sturgeon. The downside of decent wages and good supplies was death. Drilling was done by hand. Also manually, pieces of ore were loaded into wagons and then they were rolled to the surface, and this work was mostly done by women. Up to 70 wagons per shift. The average life expectancy of men in Kolovanstroy was only 35 to 40 years. Women lived a little longer, but then the same thing happened to them: silicosis and other lung diseases. In 1960, the mine, where the residents of Kolovanstroy continued to work despite the danger to their health and lives, was closed. At the same time, the residents gradually began to leave the settlement in search of new jobs. The last residents of the settlement left in 1980. In the ruined ghost town, you can see the monument in memory of the miners who once worked here, and walk among the foundation of houses. And of course, you can climb into the mine itself, if you are not scared. Where haven't we been yet? The Far East, Kolyma, Altai, the European Plateau, or the North Caucasus, especially since it is not typical North Caucasus at all. European architecture with small graceful buildings and neat streets. These are quite uncharacteristic views for an isolated mountain gorge among the Caucasus Mountains, where simple and sturdy rural houses are more common. The village of Sadon in North Ossetia was built by the Belgians in the 19th century, but today it is almost abandoned. Back in the 1760s, large deposits of lead, zinc and silver were found in the Alagirsky Gorge. The Sadonskaya deposit was the first in the Russian Empire and remained the largest until the 1980s. Major exploration of this mine began only in the middle of the 19th century, when roads were built up to the mountain to the place of extraction. The Russian Empire invited the best specialists from abroad to build the enterprise itself and the town around it under such difficult conditions. Many of the mines were first built by Greeks, as they were good masons, and later the Belgian Mining and Chemical Society leased the sites for 60 years. In 1886, the Belgians started to build houses for the miners' families and infrastructure. A school, a hospital, and roads were built. After the 1917 revolution, the enterprise was nationalized. The Belgians left, and the Sadonsky lead and zinc combined began to grow at a tremendous pace. It was considered very prestigious to get a job here. By 1940, about 4,000 people worked and lived here. And during the Great Patriotic War, every third or every second bullet was cast from the lead mined in Sadon. Ore was mined at a colossal rate, and the deposit was gradually depleted. By the mid-1980s, ore mining was virtually stopped, and after the collapse of the USSR, the plant could barely stay afloat. And then came a new misfortune. In 2002, the Sadonsky lead and zinc combined and the village itself were destroyed by a mudflow brought by the flood in Sadonka River. After the disaster, the first floors of many houses were covered with mud and rendered uninhabitable. It was no longer possible to restore the village, and in 20 years there is almost no trace left of the former luxurious architecture. Everything is crumbling and decaying. Stray cats wander around the remains of the village, which are fed by villagers from the neighboring settlements and tourists, fans of abandoned places. Now a ghost town and once the coal center of the Perm Krai, its history dates back to 1778, when the first mines were established here. The explorers and workers who arrived in the region settled in the village on the bank of the Kosva River. The coal mining industry of the region developed rapidly, and in 1941 Verkhnya, or as they now say Staraya Gubacha, received the status of a town. Schools, house of culture worked, a railroad passed through the town, but the prosperity was short-lived. When coal mining in the Kiselovsky coal basin began to decline in the 1960s, the population began to shrink. The coke and chemical plant and Metafrax, a major producer of methanol, helped the agglomeration to survive. But due to harmful factory emissions, all the old districts of the city, especially the former administrative center Verkhnya Gubacha, had to be evicted. Local residents were relocated to the so-called Novaya Gubacha. By the way, the same fate almost befell the town of Yubileyny, founded in 1957, which was home to 11,000 people and was only 10 kilometers from Gubacha. Mine was closed and town will be gone soon. Abandoned houses in Yubileyny are slowly dismantled, and on the industrial side of the closed mine there is now a corrective labor colony. This semi-abandoned town has its own landmark. In 1993, a native of Yubileyny presented the townspeople with an ISU-152 self-propelled gun, unofficially named Beast Killer. The combat vehicle still stands on a pedestal amidst the crumbling city. The name of the former settlement deep in the Ryazan forests was given by Lithuanian exiles who were deported by the Tsarist government, and the area strongly reminded them of their native Curonian speed. With the advent of Soviet power, they began to harvest timber here, and from 1927 they sent it to Vladimir and Ryazan by rail. The working settlement began to grow rapidly, but in 1936 a terrible fire destroyed Kursha. There is a legend that on the night from August 2nd to August 3rd, an empty freight train arrived in Kursha too. The train crew, knowing about the approaching fire, offered to save at least women and children, but the dispatcher was adamant and preferred to save the harvested wood. So some of the men went to load the platforms in the morning, while others went toward the fire to try and contain it. In the meantime, the wind had picked up and people began to suffocate from the smoke. When they heard the roar of the firestorm in Kursha too, panic broke out. Everyone who was in the village and at the logging sites rushed to the train. They saw it as their only salvation. Men put women with children and infants right on top of the timber and climbed up there themselves. The train was able to start and even gain some speed, but then it became clear that the fire had managed to bypass the village and cut the railroad track ahead. The wooden bridge over the small river was already in full blaze, the forest was burning on both sides and people were trapped in the fire. Only a store survived the fire in the village itself. Officially it is known about 313 dead. In reality the death toll is likely to be more than 1,000. On August 3, 2011, on the day of the 75th anniversary of the tragedy, in the presence of the last living witness of the fire, a memorial cross and a memorial plaque were installed at the place which once was Kursha II. And at last we have an entire agglomeration of ghost towns that has formed around Vorkuta, Komi Republic. Vorkuta is the fourth most populous city in the Arctic Circle and the easternmost city in Europe. And yet it is likely to disappear from the face of the earth in the next 50 years. To be honest, I'd really like to dedicate a big separate video to Vorkuta, but that's in the future. Vorkuta is a single industry town, the main production of which is focused on coal mining. There is one town-forming enterprise, Vorkuta Ugol. Vorkuta is surrounded by an entire system of suburbs, mainly settlements at mines with a total population of 113,000 people. In the best times it was 178,000. Most of them form a ring with a circumference of about 50 kilometers, passing through Vorkuta itself. Октябрьский, Северный, Юршор, Промышленный, Варгашор, Комсомольский are arranged counterclockwise. To be more precise, they used to be arranged. Nowadays only two of them, Severny and Vargashor, are alive, so the ring has been broken. Only 5 of Vorkuta's 13 mines remain, and the deserted settlements have become ghost towns amidst the bare tundra. And in Vorkuta itself, life and death collide in a surprising way. Sports clubs open, markets still operate, noisy groups gather near shopping malls, and in the background, crumbling constructions, abandoned buildings with charred walls and collapsed roofs where people haven't lived for a long time, half-burned schools, and people have already gotten used to this picture. In simple terms, the city was created artificially for quite specific purposes: to mine coal, to develop the land so that the Soviet Union would have resources. The first people arrived here less than 100 years ago, and of course, the city was built by Gulag prisoners. If it were not for all these factors, a large city would never have appeared in these lands, because the places here are not very suitable for living. Polar winter of 8 months, constant penetrating winds and blizzards, farming is impossible, you can't get there by car, there are no roads. No one knows exactly how many people actually live here. The thing is, it is almost impossible to sell one's house in here. Here's an apartment in Vorkuta, some furniture, a bathroom, a kitchen, 75,000 rubles, less than $1,000. And no, it is not the price per month, it's for the whole apartment. And this is in Vorkuta itself, in a place where tens of thousands of people still live. In the suburbs, things are even worse. Here's the settlements of Vargashor, 4-room apartment, 60,000. It even has a good location, near a school, one of the 2 remaining in the town, near some stores. If you search, you can find options of some 3-bedroom apartments for 20–30,000 rubles. Actually, you don't even really have to spend anything. There is enough house and it was simply left with all the furniture. Just according to official data, there are more than 14,000 empty apartments within the city borders. People were leaving everything just to get out of this northern frozen hell. And of course, it was worth mentioning the settlement of Khalmyr-Yu separately. Perhaps the establishment of a town in this place was doomed to failure, because Khalmyr-Yu means river in the valley of death in Nenets language. The locals have long considered these places sacred and used to bring their dead relatives here to bury them in the permafrost of the valley. Like many other cities and towns, Khalmyr-Yu lived with the mine and died with the mine. In late 1993, the mine was decided to be liquidated due to unprofitability and depletion of reserves. By the end of October 1995, funding for the resettlement program was completely cut off, and the town's boiler plant was shut down. About 100 of the remaining families heated their homes with pot-belly stoves and electric heaters. Why didn't they want to leave? Because they were allowed to take only a part of their belongings, and the new apartments for them were not even built yet. Nevertheless, the government was impatient. The ultimate liquidation of Khalmyr-Yu was carried out in 1995 by OMON forces. The law enforcers kicked down the doors, packed the last inhabitants into wagons and transported them to Vorkuta. All wooden houses of the settlement were burned down for some reason, and the remaining stone houses were turned into a testing ground for cruise missiles. On August 17, 2005, during a strategic aviation exercise, a Tu-116 bomber carrying Russian President Vladimir Putin launched 3 missiles at the building of the former House of Culture in the settlement of Khalmyr-Yu. In general, Vorkuta is probably the most depressing city in Russia, even more depressing than poisonous Norilsk. Tourists visit this city for a glimpse of history and the gloomy aesthetics of abandonment. The former grandeur combined with the sense of doom in the air. Nothing but depression and despondency are evoked by such pictures. And probably respect for people who are willing to tolerate such living conditions out of love for their hometown. What to do with the city is unclear. Is there any sense to improve infrastructure and logistics as well as to add jobs? In the USSR, miners were a highly paid elite. Now, not everyone wants to ruin their health for $600 to $700 a month in the northern hell. Maybe Vorkuta's time has simply passed and we need to let it go? In fact, this is not all of them. There are remnants of the former greatness of the Soviet Empire scattered all over the country, but no video will be enough to list them all. But a post on Patreon will. Please subscribe. There is Alekeli in the Krasnoyarsk region, a former military pilot town, and Makhovoye in the Moscow region, which completely burned out in the 2010 fires. Amdarma on the Kara Sea and Iultin in Chukotka, towns of resource miners which became useless in the 90s. And Nizhneyansk in Yakutia, which even has an airfield and a few residents left, but it is clearly living out its last years. So perhaps this list can be revisited in another 10 years, and new points can be added to the map. Thanks for watching, and as always, a huge shout out to my biggest Patreon supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Berze, Jimmy Albin, Eli, Petr Ilich, and Bruce Ettering. See you guys next time.